John David, with Professor John David Zwern from the University of Hawaii, in which he talked about like his own conception of electronic literature. And today we proceed with the seminars, which is organized by the Laboratory Language, Literature, Imaginary, and Aesthetic at the Faculty of Letters and the Human Sciences Sais. So as I said before, it is with great pleasure and gratitude that we host today one of the leading figures of electronic literature and the world intellectual landscape. So before I give the floor to my colleague, Professor Daoudi, to introduce our guest, let me remind you that please can those like, there is some noise and I wish that the audience switch off the, unmute the mic to avoid the noise. So I will give the floor to my colleague, Professor Daoudi, who is a professor at the Faculty of Letters and Human Sciences Sais, to introduce our guests. And let me remind you that the webinar runs for 40 minutes, two sessions. In each session, we have 40 minutes. And I will send you the ID for the second session, which I think you might have already received. So the floor is yours, Professor Daoudi, to introduce our guests.
Thank you very much, Professor Fahli. Do you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Professor Mourad. And thank you, Professor Katherine Hayles, for accepting the invitation. We are very delighted to have Professor Hayles with us today, speaking to our students and to our professors about digital humanities and digital literature. This is a very important issue to us. And Katherine Hayles is a professor of literature at Duke University. Her interdisciplinary work has centered on the relations of literature, science, and technology in the 20th and 21st centuries. Professor Hayles has been a frequent visitor and collaborator with institutions and been an important inspiration in writing in person for the strong world interest in digital humanities. First, she is visiting professor at Durham University, and she has received honorary doctorates and awards from different universities worldwide. Professor Hayles has published foundational texts, including books and important articles on electronic.
Mr. Daoudi, can you activate your mic, please? We don't hear you, Mr. Daoudi. Can you activate? Yes, now we hear you.
Is that okay now?
Yeah, now
it's okay.
Yes, it's great now.
All right, thank you. So she has been at the forefront of understanding the relation of contemporary print books to computer code, including the ways in which code and language overlap and diverge, on how contemporary print books are influenced by digital practices in composition, production, and dissemination. She has published influential analyses of contemporary works of science fiction and speculative fiction, winning the Pilgrim Prize for Lifetime Achievement from the Science Fiction Research Association in recognition for her work, as well as the Eaton Award for the best book in science fiction theory and criticism for How We Became Post-Human book. Recent work has turned to consider the influence of digital media on human cognition, a topic explored in her book, How We Think, Digital Media and Contemporary Technogenesis. Her work aroused a shift in cognitive modes from deep to hypertension and attracted international attention and stimulated discussions through Europe, North America, and the UK. Professor Hayles has won numerous prizes, awards, and fellowships for her work and is now considered the founding theoretician in the digital humanities. We're very, very delighted to have Professor Hayles today with us to speak to us about this issue about electronic literature and digital humanities in general. Thank you very much, Professor Hayles.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Very thorough. Thanks so much for researching that. I will now do a share screen because I've prepared a PowerPoint for us. So we'll see if they can, if the host would please enable my share screen, we'll
Yes,
get
yes.
started. Thank you. It says
Now you
it's,
can, yes, you can now.
okay,
You can.
very good. Thank you. Well, I feel that I'm somewhat in the position here of being a World War II survivor, part of a vanishing generation. I think that I was among the first generation to become seriously interested in electronic literature as a field. Electronic literature dates back to the 1950s when people were using computers to write poems, generative poems, and other kinds of electronic literature. But it wasn't really until the mid 1990s that it began to emerge as a distinct field. And I was privileged to be part of that field building. So I'll talk a little bit about my role in that and the role of many others as well. So what excites me about electronic literature? I think I first became aware of electronic literature through my association with Michael Joyce, one of the pioneers in hypertext novels. And I was tremendously excited when I realized that the computer could be utilized with all of its affordances for literary texts. Part of what excited me was my critical interest, because the computer offered an expanded repertoire of signs, links, multiple paths, music, sound, typography, animation, most of which were simply not available with static print text. But then I also had a very strong theoretical interest in this massive shift in the generation of textual signs. So I liken it to being alive in the 15th century and being a scribe in a medieval monastery, and a visitor is coming up the dusty trail on a donkey, and in his saddlebags, he's carrying a copy of Gutenberg's Bible. And he brings that to the library and opens it. And I'm astonished. Here is a whole new way to create text. And I'm suddenly imagining I'm going to be out of a job. Oh, no, wait, maybe I can be interested in this new field. So that's somewhat the way I felt when I realized that the computer with its code underlayment could be so heavily involved in a literary field like electronic textuality. And I remember at the time I was at UCLA saying to one of my colleagues, a very distinguished scholar, a wonderful, wonderful writer, remarking, "The age of print is passing." And he looked at me and said, "I have no idea what you mean by that." So I realized that not only were there strong critical interests, strong theoretical interests, but also strong cultural interests. At that time, the UCLA English department was a strongly print-based department. And my colleagues, even a scholar astute as the one I just mentioned, were still very much in the print regime. And I realized that I had a front row seat to this massive transformation that was in the process of happening with print culture. And of course, I thought, oh, I have to be involved in this. So one of the ways that I was involved was through the NEH summer seminars. At that time, the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US offered the possibility for professors at major universities to offer summer seminars in a specialized topic that would bring 12 scholars from across the country to that university to study for the summer for 8 weeks. So in 1995, I proposed the first seminar in electronic literature that I called Literature in Transition, a very hopeful title there because I felt that electronic literature was going to change the whole ball game. And then I offered similar versions of those seminars in 1998 and 2001. And we had many exciting meetings discussing all kinds of issues, but I think the lasting value of those seminars was to build professional networks between people who were writing electronic literature, critics like me who were interested in it, and people in the digital humanities who had an interest in it as well. And as I look now over the list of the scholars, the 36 scholars over 3 years who participated in that, it almost reads like a who's who of electronic literature. Many of those people went on to become major figures in the field. So these were very important seed box experiments where people got to know each other, shared ideas, and shared their excitement about the field. So the Electronic Literature Organization had been started by Scott Retberg out of Chicago about that time. And he had found a sponsor in the .com industry that at that time was flourishing and booming like crazy, who was willing to subsidize the Electronic Literature Organization. And Scott's patron subsidized the first important conference in the US in electronic literature held at UCLA, which I helped to bring about in 2001. But shortly thereafter, there was the .com crash, the funds all dried up, funding disappeared. And I had recently accepted a position at my university as Associate Vice Chancellor. And when you take on administrative work like that, you get a brief honeymoon. So the honeymoon just happened to correspond with the .com crash. And so I was able to ask my boss for some resources that enabled the Electronic Literature Organization to move to UCLA, get an office, get a research assistant from 2001, 2006. And during that time, I and also many others were building a repertoire of courses and readings for electronic literature. And when I would go to conferences or talks, keynotes, and give lectures about this, I frequently got the question in the audience, how do you find the good stuff? The web is like the Wild West. You can roam endlessly and never find anything you're truly interested in reading. And I realized that for a nascent field like this, it was important to build a canon. Of course, many people in literature were questioning the canon, but those were print canons. And the field of electronic literature was an entirely different stage. So I was invited to join the editorial collective that put out the first electronic literature collection. And partly at my insistence, back in those days, I think that was something like 2005, I insisted that we do a CD-ROM version of the collection as well as on the web. In fact, one poetic team that we very much wanted to have on the collection refused to join precisely because we were putting out a CD-ROM, which this team regarded as retrograde. But I had been lecturing in places like Albania, Croatia, Russia, and other places, and I knew that not every place in the world had a strong internet infrastructure, and that there would be many people elsewhere in the world who simply could not access texts on the web, but most computers did have CD-ROM drives at that point. They could slot in a CD-ROM and play it in that way. So the first collection was, I think, the only collection that made that decision. And now we're up to volume 3 of the electronic literature collection. And one of the notable developments that happened during this time was a movement to the international stage out of North America. That had already happened to some extent with ELC2, but ELC3 really burst upon the international stage in a big way. And you can see here all the works that were featured in Arabic, Dutch, English, French literature, and so on and so forth, and a wide international distribution, Portugal, Slovakia, and so forth. And then in 2018, I was privileged to be a keynote speaker at the first conference devoted to electronic literature in Arabic, which was held in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and hosted by Riham Hosni, who herself was one of the pioneers in interpreting electronic literature in Arabic. And there are articles in the Electronic Book Review about that conference, which yielded some fascinating conversations. It was my first little glimpse into what Arab scholars and poets and writers were doing in electronic literature. And I was blown away by the sophistication of some of that work. So it's sort of conventional, to think about electronic literature as taking place in three waves. So the first wave were the standalone hypertext and CD-ROM poetry. Story Space played an important role in that early stage by publishing standalone hypertexts like Afternoon by Michael Joyce, Victory Garden by Stuart Malthrop, and so forth. And they also published some e-poetry. But even by the 2005, when I wrote my book on electronic literature, it was clear that this first wave was being eclipsed by the second wave, e-lit on the web, which offered a much more robust platforms, much more variety of affordances than Story Space ever had. So there was an enormous expansion of expressive possibilities. And then the present president of the ELO, Leonardo Flores, has identified a third wave, electronic literature now written for small screens, cell phones, and so on and so forth. And in a country like Morocco, where it may be that everybody does not have a computer, it may also be that the proliferation of cell phones is much more pervasive than computers, as it is, for example, I know in India. And so it's really important that e-lit works of great quality are now available on cell phones as well. So some of the other major contributors to the formation of electronic literature as a field is the Electronic Book Review, which has published some of the major work on electronic literature and was overseen for many years by Joseph Tabby. And you can see here one of the newest works, Gardening E-Literature, or How to Effectively Plant the Seeds for Future Investigations on Electronic Literature by Anna Notcher. So people are still thinking about how and why to grow the field. And a very important other contributor is Dini Gregar at the Washington State University in Vancouver. Dini and her lab there are doing fantastic archival work. They're interviewing many of the early creators of electronic literature, such as Judy Malloy, Shelley Jackson, Stuart Malthrop, and so on and so forth, getting interviews with them, showing their works, and also sponsoring a number of events. So some of the events at the Electronic Literature Lab at Washington that I participated was a reading of Afternoon and Afternoon with Afternoon, in which 12 of us all got together and read through this very important early hypertext. It was kind of a celebration and also a recognition of the important early canon of electronic literature. But of course, any literary form that is tied to the computer has an Achilles heel of obsolescence. And we saw this with devastating effect this year when Flash was no longer supported. This made many of the premier works in the electronic literature canon inaccessible. They simply won't play unless they're reprogrammed and migrated to other platforms. And we'll see an example of that shortly. But in response to this, Dini has launched a new initiative at the Electronic Literature Lab called Next. And one of the next projects is After Flash, where she and her team of graduate students and postdocs and research assistants are trying to save as much of those Flash works as they can by porting them into other platforms. So we're now at a point where not only is there a very substantial literary canon of electronic literature, there's a growing canon of critical works that are indispensable as well. And I had the honor of establishing a prize to recognize the best critical work in electronic literature that I support each year. And here are, I was not a winner of my own prize, but I just put that book up there since it, to my knowledge, it was the first monograph on solely on electronic literature, which I published in 2008. But here are the winners, and you go down to 2016. A wonderful project where 3 different people, a literary critic, a programmer, and a critical platform studies person, all contributed to reading William Poundstone's project for Tactoscope. That was a wonderful joint collaborative project. Joseph Tabby won the award for Bloomsbury Handbook of Electronic Literature. Scott Retberg's wonderful book, Electronic Literature, which has completely eclipsed my early work, is much more thorough and much more contextually based than I was able to do in 2008. So this has now become, I think, one of the essential books in the canon. Mark Marino, Critical Code Studies, and recently, just this year, Jessica Pressman for her wonderful book, Bookishness. And you may wonder why a book called Bookishness has won the prize for electronic literature criticism. But Jessica and I collaborated on a book called Comparative Textual Media, where we argued that one of the great critical advantages of a field like electronic literature is that it brings print into view as a medium. We spent several centuries in the print era, and to that extent, print became somewhat transparent. We simply accepted print as the default. But with the advent of electronic literature, we now have powerful new ways to think about print itself as a medium. And that's part of what Jessica does in her book. So with that, I'll conclude my introduction and pass the baton on to my collaborator, Marjorie Luesebrink, who writes under the pen name of MD Coverley, to talk about one of her works as well. So I'll stop screen share and turn it over to Margie.
Wow, I love your background, Kate. Present, I haven't really had a chance to look at the group, but I will say that it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Kate, for your really wonderful coverage of the literature. Am I on now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Professor.
Okay. So it's really interesting to be able to look at Kate's summary in a quick hurry of the field And I know that all of you got to see some very fine pieces introduced by John Zern in your last session. And so you have some good background for the piece that I'm going to talk about today, this first one. And it is actually a very contemporary piece, and it reflects exactly what Kate has been talking about and John alluded to, in the sense of elit authors looking today to find stable platforms to use for authoring systems, having had Director be discontinued, Flash be discontinued, a dozen other authoring platforms have come and gone in the 21, 22 years or so that I've been writing electronic literature. Most recently, since the discontinuation of Flash, a collaborator of mine, Stephanie Strickland, and I did a piece in PowerPoint. A year before that, I finished a series of works that were done in Excel, because I had figured that the only thing I knew that was still backwards compatible, retroactive for years and years, were the spreadsheets. That apparently the accountants don't want to lose their material, but it's all right if the artists do. So I worked in Excel, and most recently I've been working with little video pieces that are kinetic, and they are hypertextual, and they are an attempt to blend some of the kinetic meaning that John was talking about in the last session with the typical hypertextual staples of image, motion, text, sound, and structure. This work also answers another question that came up in the last session about accessibility for regular people. In the very beginning, much of the electronic literature was done by single practitioners working at home with whatever tools they had at hand. And and that went by the by as larger and larger conglomerations began to control both the platforms and the software that you could use. And so the issue of accessible materials and accessible products for all of us, whether we're in the United States or we're in any other country in the world, is still a serious consideration for all artists. Therefore, the piece I'm going to show you, Pacific Surfliner, was made with videos taken with my cell phone, images taken with my cell phone. It was compiled on Roxio, which is a video editor, but there are plenty of good video editors out there. It was the still images were done with Irfan, which is free. And of course, the music is recycled and recompiled. And so that, in a sense, gets as close as we can to workable, common, off-the-shelf use of materials to make electronic literature. The other thing about this is the attempt to bring a certain kind of engagement that that we always hope happens into the issue of reading or watching. And of course, this piece you will see is both performative and a reading piece. And we can talk about how to see that later. I'm going to share my screen. I think I'm going to share my screen. I cannot actually. Find the share screen.
Margie, it should be at the bottom of your
Yes.
screen.
Yeah, I've got it
It's
at the bottom here, but
Yeah.
I just found it. It's in a different place than it had been before. Okay, so it says, Kate, it says document. Why am I not getting web?
You should have an option for your desktop. And if you have it on your desktop, you can play it from there.
I'm sorry.
Well, if I can make a suggestion, why don't I go back and we'll come back to Margie's presentation in a minute, but I'll go on to another one that we wanted to show for you today. Would that be all right? And meantime, we hope that we can.
I can't. Yeah, I'll see why I can't do that. But yes.
All
thank
right.
you.
So I'll go back to sharing screen here. Okay.
I can't share while you're sharing, so I can't figure it out.
All right, so I wanted to show Nick Montford's Taroko Gorge. Taroko Gorge is a location, very picturesque location in Japan. And Nick visited there and thought it was so beautiful that he created this generative poem based on it. And it's full of natural imagery appropriate to the site. Mist roams the coves, shapes range the vein, shade the rough, sinuous, straight, clear, forest frames the rocks, stones frame the coves, and it'll go on like that. But what I want to show you here is the view source for this poem. So you can see here right in the copyright notice at the beginning of the code, it says permission to use, copy, modify, and or distribute this software for any purpose is hereby granted. And so as a result, there were a number of writers who took Nick up on his generous offer here and who created variations of Taroko Gorge by putting some of their own code in. So if you look at the code here, you'll see, even if you're not intimately familiar with coding language, this happens to be in JavaScript, you can see that there are variables here for the different verbs, transitive and intransitive verbs, for imperatives, for sites, and so forth. So with a very minimum of effort, you could accept Nick's challenge and put in your own version of this. And I think that'd be actually a fascinating project for the seminar to take on, to create multiple variations of this. And we'll look at a couple of these other variations. Here's Scott Retberg's variation, Tokyo Garage. So we'll see if we can get that one up. So you can see immediately Scott changed the background to black from the green, natural green, changed the color of the font, and completely changed the vocabulary to kind of a grunge motif. Freak's dream, traffic jam comforts the author, sing, damn you, sing the curvy definitive neon signs, smells the bureaucrats, and so on. So you can see that the feeling of this is completely different than for Nick's poem. So that's an interesting example of how you can take over code. It's a form of creation that really pays off for collaborative work and makes for some very interesting possibilities. So I'll stop screen share now and we'll go back to Margie.
Let me just like 1 moment, because the session will end now. Shall we start a new session to make sure that there is no interruption?
Okay,
Okay.
sure. That's,
so I sent
fine.
the ID. I sent the ID in the discussion. So let's log in again to a new session, if it is possible for
All right.
everyone.
To be continued.
Yes,
Thank
to
you.
be continued. Thank you so much. Thank you. In a moment.